Communication Studies podcast. My name is Justin Young. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Communication Studies at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. My guest this week is the director of the School of Communication Studies, Sandy Pensoneau-Conway. Did I get the pronunciation right?
You did. Congratulations. Okay. Thank you.
It's one of the, I so rarely say your last name. I'm always afraid I'm going to mispronounce it. Sandy is an associate professor, and I should note that she is Dr. Sandy Pensoneau-Conway. In addition to that, her PhD is actually from here in SIU originally. And so, Sandy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to do this.
So if you haven't listened to episode 0, and whether it's actually up or not, I'll have to find out later. But basically the idea behind this podcast is to kind of demystify some of communication as a field, as an academic area, as something that we all do as part of our daily lives. But sometimes we don't talk about it. And I feel like there's, like with a lot of academia, there's that barrier between what we do and what the general public maybe knows about what we do. And so this podcast is really about kind of tearing that down. So we'll be talking to some of the faculty members here at SIU, but we'll also be bringing in some guests, hopefully from time to time, and talking to them about communication more broadly. So Sandy is our first guest, and she's the director of the newly minted School of Communication Studies, so as of this summer. So would you mind kind of filling us in? What is the job of a chair, your previous title, and your new job as director? What is that? What do you do in that position?
It's something I actually really love because it's a lot of problem solving and putting puzzles together and things like that. And so I have to figure out scheduling. I have to figure out how we might spend our money. In many ways, the director or the chair of a university academic program is the face of that program amongst the rest of the university. So I'm in meetings a lot with the dean of the college or with other faculty members, other groups we're collaborating with, and so on and so forth. And so basically, I see my job as both a leader and an administrator. And so there are those duties that are just like kind of like mundane. My colleague Johnny Gray calls them administrivia. And there are those day-to-day business sort of things that have to happen to make sure our classes are offered and our students have what they need. But then there's also creating the perception amongst the university that what we do is valuable, that our people are valuable, and quite simply, it's not just a perception, but it is the reality. I very much appreciate all of the people I work with and what I get to do every day.
All right, great. And so tell us a bit about the classes that you teach here. So your position as director does give you a course release, so you're maybe not in the classroom as much now as you used to be, but what sort of courses do you teach?
Yeah, you're very right about that. I do, because of the administrative work, I only teach one class per semester. And in the fall, I teach what we call Com Studies 501, which is Introduction to Communication Studies Research. And this course, I get the chance to hang out for the whole semester with all of our new graduate students in the program. And we do talk about research. How do you start a research project? How do you orient yourself to the research? What does it matter what you assume about the world and those sort of questions? But we also talk about what does it mean to be a member of an academic discipline? What are the ethical choices that you have to make as part of that? What are the kind of things that you have to consider as you look long-term at your career? And also, what could you do with this graduate degree in communication studies if you didn't necessarily want to stay in academia? It's one of my favorite classes to teach because I love working with new graduate students. And that's one that happens every fall.
So what are some of those things that are responsibilities or, charges for someone in an academic field?
When we're talking about research, I think some of the more ethical questions that one has to ask themselves is, why am I doing this research in the first place? Who am I trying to benefit? How am I going about doing it? Am I being respectful of the participants who are doing this research with me, who I've asked, please give me your time, give me your efforts, give me your stories, give me your experiences. Well, what do you do with those then? Because that's a powerful position to be able to tell and retell someone else's story.
Sure.
Or even if it's just a survey response, you still have something that somebody else gave to you. So you have a responsibility to treat that ethically. There's also considerations about who your audience is. So who are you writing for? There's kind of an old saying, I don't know how old it is, but, a thought in academia that there aren't very many people really that read the thing that you publish, because not anybody can just go find that. If it's in an academic journal that costs money, that's not available to everybody. So one of the things we're trying to figure out now is...
And we should note about those academic journals, it's not just that they cost money, it's that often they're cost prohibitive. I mean, they're into the hundreds or even thousands of dollars for a subscription. Right. So it's not like Time Magazine where you can run out and buy the latest issue. Yeah,
that's a really good point. So it's both financially inaccessible as well as literally inaccessible. Like I can't, if I'm not a part of a university that already has that journal, I really have to go to a lot of work to get it. And once I have it too, there is a tendency to write in this sort of fashion that isn't a language that's common to a lot of people. So we do talk in that class about, well, how do you write to an audience where your words are going to be available to people, where they don't feel like, well, I can't understand this. This is written. This isn't for me. And so is there a way that we can, in academia, make the things that we do more available to people? One of the things that we've talked about is, well, what about blogs that are written by academics?
Sure.
And I feel like there is a trend where blog posts are becoming just as credible, sometimes, depending on who you ask, even more credible than academic research. They might not be peer-reviewed in the same sense, but if you look at the comment section, they're certainly reviewed by people. So, they do have a sense of review about them, and they're much more available financially. They're more accessible. Somebody can just, if you have access to the internet, somebody can go read them, So that's one of the questions that we've been talking about here and there is, can I publish a blog, and does it make it to my curriculum vitae? And what does that mean for me to cite other people's blogs?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the curriculum vitae and why that might matter for somebody starting out in a PhD program is that when they get to a university post-graduation and they're applying for tenure, they're going to need a certain number of publications, right?
Yeah, certainly depending on what university and what program they're in. That oftentimes is one of the things that a review committee is going to look for.
And so generally, traditionally, I guess I should say, a lot of university tenure review boards would not accept blog post or a YouTube video or something of that nature. They're looking for those peer-reviewed journals.
I would say, like you said, traditionally, yes, they are going to be looking for those. One of the nice things about the way I think that we do tenure here is that it's the responsibility of the chair or director to give a context to whatever the review committee is going to read. And so that would mean that as the director of our school, if we had a faculty member going up for tenure, I would be able to provide a context for why this blog post really is an important demonstration of this person's role in the discipline, why this is something worthy of being a contributory factor to a positive tenure review. I'm not sure that it's like that everywhere. I'm only familiar with our process most immediately, but I feel like that's the responsibility of the chair to say, certainly if the person only has blog posts or YouTube videos, that might not necessarily be the thing that's going to get a positive vote. But if programs are like ours, they recognize creative activity as scholarship too. And so something like a YouTube video may fall under creative activity, of course, depending on what it is and what it's meant to do.
So one thing I realized, we're talking about this for a general audience, and we're throwing around the term
Right.
tenure.
Yeah.
And I realized that, I think most people are familiar with the term, but they may not exactly know what tenure is. So could you explain briefly what tenure is?
Yeah, absolutely. Tenure isn't just in the university setting. At least to my knowledge, I haven't been in the K-12 setting for a number of years. That was a past life of mine. But at least at that time, tenure was also part of what a teacher could maybe eventually get in the K-12 setting too. But it's tenure is, I wouldn't say a guarantee, but it does provide some job security that you have met certain benchmarks during your time here so far, and you put together a portfolio of sorts, which we technically call a dossier, that lists everything that you've done while you've been at that institution, and depending on the situation, maybe even prior to being at that institution, but that shows that you have been a great contributor to the life of that institution, to the life of your discipline, that you are active in your research, teaching, and service, and that you deserve job security while you're here. And it shows and if you receive a positive vote, it shows that the university also values what you do, or at least values what other people have said that you do, such that it would be difficult for them to say, we're letting you go. You need to go find another job.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm not sure the K-12 system, how that works, particularly now.
Yeah,
I know
right.
certainly tenure used to be a big part of that. So you talked about that was your fall course. What do you normally teach in the spring?
In the spring, I usually teach a course that has something to do with communication pedagogy. Communication pedagogy is an area of study. It's kind of communication studies focus on the teaching and learning process. And so as a communication pedagogy scholar...
So that being what pedagogy means.
Yeah,
it means
pedagogy.
Teaching.
Right. Yeah, pedagogy, it's kind of a surface level definition, but it essentially is the process of teaching and learning, the art of teaching and learning, and the relationships that are built in that context. As a communication pedagogy scholar, I study what is communication's role in that teaching and learning process, as well as how do we teach communication concepts. So it's kind of both of those sides, communication in educational context, as well as the teaching and learning of communication. One of the courses I recently taught around that was one of my favorite courses I've ever taught, and unfortunately it got interrupted by the pandemic, as so many things did, but it was a course in public pedagogy. So it was looking at how do we learn things outside of the classroom. So how does something like a museum act as an educational context, or even the mall? How does that teach us about social ideas? How does it teach us about concepts like consumerism and capitalism? How might we learn from songs and music videos and movies and pop culture? One of the movies that we didn't get to because of the pandemic, but I was so excited to watch, was Beyonce's Homecoming. I mean, that's a highly pedagogical film in the way it pulls in, especially HBCU, historically Black colleges and universities, and gives some history of those, how it features and really highlights the role of HBCUs in not just Black culture, but pop culture. And, Beyonce talked a lot about why she didn't go to college. And it's just the whole film, I mean, aside just being from Beyonce. So, we could stop there.
There's a certain charm
yeah,
just
there sure
on that
is.
surface level.
And the music. But if you listen to Beyonce's music, there's such a message of empowerment and resisting social ideas of what Black women should be. And I think she took that and just exploded it in this space of Coachella, which it features her performance at Coachella. And yeah, I don't know how I got on Beyonce. Oh, because of the public pedagogy course. Yeah. But yeah, like something like Homecoming, how does that teach people something? So that was really cool.
What's the value of that for a communication studies PhD? I mean, are we thinking that they will go out and make films. They'll go out and do public displays at the mall. They'll go out, or is this more of a way for them to think about bringing the knowledge that a student might be obtaining from the outside world and being aware of that and bringing that into the classroom?
I think yes is the short answer. So all of that. For us, what we wanted to do was to say, there's so much. I think with the proliferation of technology and of access to information and really saturation of information, it's important for teachers in conventional educational contexts like a classroom to understand that a lot of the learning the students have done when they get to that place has not occurred in a classroom. Mm-hmm. A lot of the learning has occurred after class when they're on their phones or talking to their friends or going to their work or spending their leisure time. Like those are just as important contexts for thinking about learning as the classroom is, and in some ways even more, because probably, I don't have anything to back this up, but probably those non-classroom contexts are almost even more influential because they come into the classroom sometimes more than the classroom goes into them, I think. And so for thinking about flow of ideas and flow of learning, those spaces of learning that aren't in the classroom, that are after class, before class, during class, even sometimes if someone's on their phone, mm-hmm. those become really ripe for studying, well, what is this process that's going on here? How are these messages that our students are taking in, how are they influencing how they're also experiencing the classroom itself?
I think that's really interesting, and I think there's a great deal of truth to it, because I think it would be very interesting to poll students to see how many Pokemon they can name versus how many U.S. presidents.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if well, actually, maybe I do want to know the answer, because our presidents haven't always been so great. I'd almost rather think about the Pokemon.
No, I'm sure Pikachu is much more agreeable to he would probably have a higher favorability rate than most presidents.
Pikachu for president. Yeah.
So you've been talking some about teaching pedagogy and teaching of how we interact with students in the classroom and everything. And I know one of your research areas is disability in the classroom. Could you maybe talk about why you have an interest in disability in the classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my interests in disability in the classroom comes from seeing the classroom as a space of access. And I don't mean access necessarily connected to disability, but just in general, who has access to our classrooms? And once they get there, who has access to the ways that the teacher is constructing learning? And as a person who really loves teaching, I was thinking, how can I make my classrooms more available to a variety of people? And there was one specific student that I ended up working with who became my advisee, Dr. Julie Cosenza, who helped me, I think, to concretize this. And there was one experience that she and I wrote about in a book chapter that we wrote together, where it became so clear that our words matter as communication folks. We mm-hmm. don't just look at words, but we really understand the impact that words can have. And we have our disability or accessibility statements on our syllabi that talks about the disability support services and accommodations that a student might need for a disability in the classroom. And I had a sentence on my syllabus that I read out loud: if you need any extra help. And then I realized, oh, wait, I said extra help. And I immediately looked at Julie, too, in the class. And then I had to take a step back, too, because there were two things that happened in that moment that made me have to stop and reflect on what I was doing. The first one is that my simple act of looking at Julie called Julie out as a disabled person. Mm-hmm. And she is, Julie has dyslexia. She identifies herself as a dyslexic scholar. But I just realized my act of looking at her right as soon as I said that signaled to everybody around me who may have noticed, and to Julie herself, that there was something about her that I was referring to. And then, so I had to think, how did I just call her out, or how did I potentially just disclose information that really was up to her to disclose, not to me to disclose?
Right. And I think that's an interesting point because, sometimes that language gets used about visible versus non-visible disabilities, right?
Yeah.
And as somebody whose disability is my eyesight, I have a very non-visible disability. There are people I have known for years who one day it would just come out in conversation and they'd go, I never knew you were disabled. And, I just navigated through life without that ever being an issue.
Yeah.
So, I think that's something that definitely people overlook quite a bit and they wouldn't necessarily think of, because that term disability, right? You see handicap accessible and it's somebody in a wheelchair.
Yep.
And so that's immediately where our thought goes.
Yeah, for sure. If I can't see it, then does that person really have a disability?
Sure.
There's a almost an immediate skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I looked at her in that moment is because I realized something that I said. And I said, if you need extra help, and using the word extra made it seem as though if you're a disabled student, if you need something, it's extra for me. It's more work for me, but I'm willing to do it because I'm nice. And so it positioned any student who had a disability in that class as needing to ask for more. And that's what gave me pause too, because I thought, how is my use of the word extra? How is it making it seem like disability is a burden? And so it really encouraged me to think differently about my own perceptions and my own understandings of disability that led me to say extra help in the first place, to label it as extra. And then my verbalizing it in the classroom, how did that position students in a particular way? And then my looking at Julie in that moment, how did that potentially violate a privacy issue or call her out in a way that I didn't have the right to do? So it was a very pivotal moment. And I was really glad she was willing to write about it with me, because what we were able to do is to take that one very seemingly minuscule moment of communication and break it down to see what made that moment possible. Perceptions of disability, an educational system that hasn't always been available to students with disabilities or teachers with disabilities, the perception socially that people with disabilities are a burden, the visible versus invisible disability issue. And so there was a lot wrapped up in that little moment. And as a comm scholar, and for her as a comm scholar, we were prepared to think about that micro moment and the much bigger messages that were a part of it.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And I think that anyone who's taught for a fair amount of time has had those moments in the classroom where you catch yourself and you go, oh, why did I say that? Or why did I say it that way? Or did I just single that student out or call them out, on a wide variety of things?
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think that's really interesting because, maybe at the college level, I feel like students are probably more confident, more secure in themselves, where maybe that's less stigmatizing. But certainly at the K-12 level, I think that particularly can be traumatizing for young people to be felt as in any way othered, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think that's a really fascinating area of research. Have you done anything as far as classes here at SIU with that, as far as like teaching a class that focuses on disability?
I have. I've done it both in our department, in our program, Comm Studies, as well as the University Honors Program. The first time I did it was in the Honors Program. I taught an honors seminar called Communicating Disability, where we looked at all disability from all sorts of angles, but not so much from a medical perspective, because we wanted to look at the social construct of disability. And one of the important parts of that is understanding the difference between impairment and disability. Whereas impairment is perhaps a physical condition that one might live with, whether it's visible or invisible. Disability is what happens when there are social barriers that make that impairment, that render that impairment important and don't allow things to be accessible. So, for example, one of the great articles I read early on as a graduate student that made me really, I think, first think about this is from an article by a comm scholar named Dawn Braithwaite. And I don't remember the title of the article, but one point she made in there about disability was that if the way that we went from the first floor to the second floor was by climbing a rope, most of us would be disabled in that moment. And so we might not have an impairment, but
not
there's
just most of us, probably like 98% of us.
Right. We may not have an impairment, but there's something in the social surroundings that have made us disabled. And so that really became like a light bulb moment for me. So we talked about the difference between the social model and the medical model of disability in that course. So I taught the Communicating Disability course in the honors program twice, and then I also adapted it for a graduate. It was a mixed graduate and undergraduate summer course, one semester here in our program.
Yeah, talking about the environment and how the environment matters is really interesting because you hear a lot now, or I feel like I hear this talked about a lot more now about sort of hostile environments. And, the fact that now because of, the American with Disability Act, there are rules about having wheelchair accessibility to buildings and things of that nature. But sometimes that's around back of the building because it's been grafted on and it's like maybe a greater distance and it's by the loading dock and it's sort of an uncomfortable and it's almost a sort of, we made this for you, but we don't really want you here. We're going to make you go more out of your way. And I understand sometimes, that's, you have a 100-year-old building and you're trying to work around it, but it's not something, I think that most of us think about on a day-to-day basis. Unless you have that disability or unless you are, temporarily like on crutches or something, you really don't see that. One of the favorite things I used to, at a previous university, the engineering professors used to have an assignment where they would make students get in a wheelchair and they would put up little things all over campus and the students had to go recover one of those. It was just a rubber band or something that was hanging up on a bulletin board or something. But the whole idea was to get students thinking about how difficult it was for somebody in a wheelchair to navigate all over campus. And the students would always come back from that and just be like, I just never thought of this. This had never crossed my mind.
It's really, I think, an impactful experience to be asked to put yourself in a situation that you haven't been in before, whatever it is. One of the disadvantages of something like that, too, is that the end of the day or the end of that class, the student gets up out of the wheelchair and walks away, And so there always has to be that part of the conversation as well as, what happened? Like, how do we then become more sensitive people, or when we're in a position where we can create a building or, as engineers, well, how is this going to impact how you do your work as an engineer? And so, thinking about the fact that, well, I still have that privilege that I get up out of the wheelchair, so there's, multiple sides to something like that.
Yeah. I want to touch on, certainly one of the areas that knowing you personally and everything seems like a very big passion of yours, and that is LGBTQ rights. And so I know some of your research has been in that area, but also your work with the Rainbow Cafe here in town. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about the Rainbow Cafe, what that is, and then, maybe tell us a little bit how that ties into your research.
Yeah, for sure. The Rainbow Cafe LGBTQ Center is an organization based here in Southern Illinois that is purposed to provide social, educational, health resources to the LGBTQ community here. And we've been here for over 20 years. I've been involved with them since 2004, so close to from the beginning, but there were a few years that I didn't yet quite know about them. And our Hallmark program is our Friday night high school drop-in. And there's a lot of pizza rolls eaten and a lot of Steven Universe watched on Friday nights.
So that's the popular high school show right now.
Well, yeah, it has been for a few years. There's another one too, but I'm not cool enough to watch the show, so I don't know what it's called off the top of my head. A lot of playing of Switch, creating of memes, things like that. But it's just a place for LGBTQ youth and their ally friends to come and know that they're going to be accepted for who they are. They're not going to be misgendered. They're going to see themselves represented in the space through the books we have, the art that's on the walls, the ways that we talk about the world and things like that. So they come and they can just be whoever they want to be. One of my favorite things that happens is when there are impromptu drag shows, because they are amazing performers and their makeup there's so many YouTube tutorials on makeup that they're like makeup experts already, but that's awesome. But we have programming for all ages from high school up, and we're just about to start up again a middle school group too for middle school LGBTQ folks.
Okay, and real quick, I feel like probably we shouldn't have to, but let's go ahead and define lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer.
Yeah.
And then usually a plus added on there because there are several other letters that can be added,
sure. Thank you.
in as well. I only say that because it was just a couple years ago I used that term, and a faculty member actually asked me, what does that mean?
Oh, okay.
And so I do know that it's a term that people are still maybe not clear on.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think sometimes don't know what the acronym itself means, right?
Thank you for that pause. There's still new terms that I am learning as well. So we're all in a process of learning things.
So, the Friday night drop-in and everything, obviously, like, cool for, I think, any teenagers to have a place to go on Friday night, to hang out with other teenagers, to play games, to eat, to socialize and everything. And certainly I think you and I, having grown up in basically the same era and everything, we still remember the time when being a teenager meant going out.
Yeah.
versus sitting at home and, texting your friends and everything. And I don't want to say that none of our teenagers go out anymore, but I do think there's been a cultural shift.
Yeah.
So I think it's cool from that perspective. Why do you think it's particularly important for LGBTQ students to have a place like that? Like, what purpose do you think it's serving for them particularly?
That's an excellent question, I think, because there is a misperception that there's so much greater representation of LGBTQ people in media. There's so much, Pete Buttigieg is a gay man who is very high profile, just adopted a baby with his husband. And, we have more elected trans folk, transgender, trans folk, especially in local politics, but also national politics, than we've ever had. And so there's a misperception that we've somehow reached like an okay time socially and culturally where something like Rainbow Cafe is not needed. However, that's, as I've called it, a huge misperception, because there may be protective legislation, but it's not everywhere in the country. There may be representation, but oftentimes that representation is still highly problematic. There may be LGBTQ folks in elected positions, but put them all up against their peer counterparts, and it's the barest minimum. And so, like the famous quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when is there going to be enough women on the Supreme Court? And she said, when there's 9. And so it's a similar type of thing. We live in a place that is growing more open progressively, but we are certainly not at a place where many of LGBTQ folk feel comfortable to hold the hands of their partner, or that they feel like they can be out in their homes. And so for some youth, something like Rainbow Cafe is like their home because they might not be accepted at home. Or it is the place where they're not bullied like they're bullied at school. And I don't want to give the perception that we have, like, we're perfect. So, we're people and we still have conflict with each other and whatnot.
Sure.
But there's at least an underlying assumption that I think is found in practice that that Rainbow Cafe is, as much as we can say, safe, because we can never claim to be safe, period. But as much as possible, we are a safe place for youth to come.
So, one thing that I think is interesting, and I talk to students about sometimes, is, I'll ask them, like, did you have anybody in your high school who was out and, out publicly as being gay or lesbian or whatever? And they'll often say, oh, yeah, sure. And I think, except for maybe some private schools or some very small rural schools, that's generally true with students coming into college these days.
Yeah.
I know when I was in high school, and what I often tell students, there was one person I knew who was out, and he was out to a handful of people at best. And that was it. And I went to a high school of 900 students.
Yeah.
And I said, that's the biggest social change that I have seen in my lifetime. And probably you had a similar experience in high school.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And I went to a Catholic school too. And so certainly there was no LGBTQ club I knew zero people that were out. I have friends who I know now and still am in contact with who are LGBTQ, and I was friends with them in high school. But at that time, at least to me, they weren't out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you find that that's a pretty big shift? Even, we should know Carbondale's in Southern Illinois. If somebody's listening outside of the area who is not familiar, that Carbondale itself is a fairly established town, but the surrounding area is fairly rural. A lot of farmland, a lot of Shawnee National Forest. It's a very rural area in a lot of ways once you get outside of town, and even the outskirts of town are fairly rural. Do you find that students showing up to the Rainbow Cafe, are they finding a more accepting life in high school? Or, do you feel hope in that way, that things are better?
I absolutely feel hope that things are better. For them, it might not feel like that because they've only known what they've known. And I also don't want to fall into the back in my day, trap too. But I'm always surprised at the number of little towns around here whose high schools have GSAs, or Gender and Sexuality Alliances, which is like an extracurricular affinity group type of a club. And I hear about them, because we try to have contact with them, and I'm like, wow, they have one? That's amazing.
Right.
But at the same time, back in June for Pride Month, a town nearby had lit up their bridge in rainbow colors, and the town was outraged. And this was just 4 months ago. And it made pretty significant local news. And so I think about what kind of a message does that send to the youth of that area, and not even to the youth, but anybody of any age. And that town is just about an hour away from here and is a pretty big town. They were just appalled. And it was this huge debate as to whether or not they can have rainbow lights on their bridge. That's the thing that we need to be focusing on, So there is, I think the support is much more visible. And we also can't let that give us the perception that things are okay. And quite honestly, Illinois is one of the top states in the nation for LGBTQ protections legislatively. There are quite a few protective laws in place, but we know that laws are only one thing. What actually happens on the ground is a totally different thing. So if it comes to it, there is a law that people can draw upon, but sometimes the turmoil and the strife to get that law to be enacted can be extremely damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Rainbow Cafe, I guess we should let you do a quick plug here in 2 weeks that you're having a big event for that. Do you want to talk?
We are, yeah. Thank you. We are having our 21st anniversary gala. It's virtual as it was last year, but we'll be having a silent auction of locally donated items. They're like some of them are just I can't wait to bid on them and lose all my money. But yeah, we're having it's on Saturday, October 7th. We're live streaming our anniversary gala, and we're trying to raise money to buy our own building because we've been renting since we opened in 2000. And it really is just time that we have our own building because we're growing bigger and bigger. And so we need more space and we need it to be our own so that we can be investing in it. But anybody who's interested can find us on Facebook, and we still use Facebook. And everything's on there. All of the information, there's a Facebook event for it. We're partnering with one of the local caterers, Cristato's Bakery and Cafe, which is a super queer friendly restaurant and cafe here in Southern Illinois.
And fantastic food.
Oh my gosh, so good. And we have the support of our colleague, Johnny Gray, who has a radio show called Isn't It Queer? He's one of our sponsors, and that radio show is. And so, yeah, thanks for letting me plug it. It sometimes amazes me that we've been here 21 years, but we have been, and we're not just surviving, we're thriving. And it's because we do have an area of great support, when it comes down to it. And there are people, what is kind of an anomaly too, is that we were started by 2 churches in the area.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there were 2 churches we have more open and affirming churches now too in the area. We have about 4 that publicly are open and affirming, but there were 2 who back in 2000 saw a need for youth to need a place to go where they were affirmed and accepted. And so they started Rainbow Cafe.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'm sure makes the young people going there feel even more accepted by the local community, knowing that there are roots into the community. It's not just the university. I mean, even though yourself and other people at the university are participants over there and help out and everything, it's really great to know that it extends beyond the campus.
Yeah, it does. And we want youth to know that if, they are people of faith, that they have a place that they can go, that they don't have to choose between their religious or spiritual identity and their sexuality or their gender, that those 2 things fit very well together if they want them to.
Great. So on this subject, and I didn't include this in your introduction, but you are also the interim chair?
Interim director.
Director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program here at the university. Could you tell us a little bit about that program?
Yeah, it's an awesome program. It's highly interdisciplinary. Here at SIU, we have it available as an undergraduate minor or as a graduate certificate. So we're not a major, but we pair really well with any other major program or any other graduate program because like I said, we are very interdisciplinary. And at the core, we were formed in order to recognize that we started as women's studies, but now we're women, gender, and sexuality studies. But to recognize that gender and sexuality really becomes a structural aspect of society. And so how is society organized around, among other things, gender and sexual identity? One example of this is that I think it's only been in the last 5 years that there have been lactation rooms on campus. And in some places, those are called breastfeeding rooms. But not everybody who parents identifies as a person with having breasts, for example. So trans people can be parents as well. And the birthing parent might be trans and might need to feed their baby, but they're male identified. Number one, the fact that we've only had those for about 5 years speaks to issues of gender, as does what do we call them? SIU is one of the top universities for being open in terms of gender and sexuality. And so it doesn't surprise me that they call them lactation rooms instead of breastfeeding rooms.
Yeah, and they were just reaffirmed like
They
in the
were,
last
yeah.
month, right?
Yeah, it's been very recently. And our program here is I can't remember when it was started, though we call it WIGS, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, but it's got quite a long history. But we draw from, at the undergrad level, we have three core courses, and at the grad level, we only have two. And then your other courses can come from within the program or across the university. We try to make sure we have cross-listed courses in as many areas of the university as we can.
I want to come back to those courses in a second, but I feel like something that you and I think probably every faculty member in this department has done at some point. Could you define the distinction we're talking about when we use those terms gender versus sexuality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think so anyway. So there are two different senses of who we are, and sexuality more commonly refers to either a romantic or a sexual attraction to someone or something, whereas gender, it may seem common, but it refers to a sense of, we might normally think male, female, but we've, of course, broadened out to many gender identities. The reason why they get lumped in together quite a lot is because sexuality often is defined in terms of gender. So heterosexual, a male person being attracted to a female person, or vice versa, or lesbian, a woman who's attracted to a woman. And so that is defined in terms of gender. So that's why they get lumped together, but they really aren't necessarily the same thing. So I could identify as a lesbian, but also identify as maybe my gender identity is female, but my gender expression is male or man, or sometimes referred to as maybe a butch, more of a male-presenting woman.
Right.
Yeah, so they do get often lumped together because sexuality tends to be defined by gender. Not always, but that's a tendency.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's the confusion there, and I know that you have done presentations going into that much more in depth and everything than we have time today, but maybe that's something we can do in a future episode.
Yeah, that'd be
talk
great.
More about. So what are some of the courses that people might take from around different departments on campus and everything that would fall under the WIGS program?
We have a couple in communication studies, two of them being communication and gender, both at the 400 and 500 level. There's a very popular one that's cross-listed with English that's called Women in Literature. There's a course, I can't remember where it comes out of, but it's called Queer Visual Culture. There's quite a lot that come out of art and design. There's one that was just taught last year called Sex and Gender in Greco and Roman Art, I think. There's some courses in sociology of gender, sociology of sexuality. There's one course that also is very popular and taught quite regularly that's cross-listed with WIGS, the music program, and the Africana Studies program, which is Women, Blues, and Literature. So any course that somebody might teach, whether it's a special topics one-off course or a course that's offered regularly that focuses in any way for the majority of the course on gender or sexuality or any combination thereof, is one that we can count towards the WIGS program.
So let me get this right. Blues, women, and literature?
Women, blues, and... Wait, no, did I say... I'm sorry. I was combining that with the women in literature.
Okay.
There's one other word. I can't remember the word. Women, maybe it's just women in blues.
Okay.
That would probably make more sense.
I thought that seemed like a
I didn't even realize I said that. Yeah.
No, it's fine. I just thought that was an extremely broad course. I was like,
it is.
I would have a lot of difficulty even knowing where to start a syllabus for a course.
It must just be women in blues. That explained why you gave a chuckle, and I was like, what did I say? It didn't even occur to me that I said that, so thank you for noticing that.
I was just trying to wrap my head around what that course was.
Right.
That sounded very sort of overwhelming and daunting.
It's a 5-semester course.
Yeah, that sounds more like a whole program,
Yeah.
doesn't it, at that point? So, we kind of introduced you very early on and introduced you as director of communication studies, but we didn't really talk about what communication studies is. And so I wanted to give you a chance to maybe kind of give your quick elevator pitch of what communication studies is, because I think when people hear communication, their knee-jerk reaction is obviously going to be journalism, television production, those sorts of things, I think, are what most people think of. So what is communication studies to you?
To me, communication studies is the study of the way that human beings make meaning. And that might include some of the more digital components, like how does social media shape our perceptions of the world and of ourselves, or how might we, what decisions does a documentary filmmaker have to make particular meanings come across through the screen? So it might include that, but it doesn't necessarily. It really, any situation that involves human beings and meaning making is something that I would consider within communication studies. Now, how does that translate? From many students want to know, how does this translate to a job or something like that, right?
Absolutely.
And the hard part about it is that for us who are in the field, we're like, well, of course it does. But if you're not in the field, it is sometimes difficult to articulate how that happens. But I always go, I've been trying to recruit students recently, so I've had some of these conversations with students from different areas about why they might benefit from being in comm studies. And it really, I think, comes down to the fact that you're taking a much closer look at how relationships are being built also. So, for example, this morning I just met with a student who's in I'm not going to get the name of the program right, I don't think, but I think it's tourism and hospitality management, which if I went back to school would probably be my major, because I love stuff like that and event planning and things. But even that field, there's such a grounding in how you're building relationships with the people you work with. And on the one hand, we've all been communicating in one way or another.
Sure.
Since we were in existence, right? But what communication studies does is helps us to fishbowl that. So we're putting it in a fishbowl to study, well, what are some of the patterns of human behavior that might help me be successful with this particular goal? What are some theories of communication that might help me make sense of why this person is so angry and how I might be able to ethically and responsibly respond to that? To create a win-win situation for us. How might I craft this message on my organization's Instagram page to reach my goal? And so, message creation and interpretation, human relationship development, and meaning making, I feel like are the foundations of, I'm not sure that I could think of something that doesn't depend upon those in some way.
Absolutely. And I think, you talking about a lot today about working with diverse populations and thinking about how we communicate with those diverse populations. And I think that's something that's obviously incredibly valuable. It always has been valuable, but now there's a great more emphasis put on it. There's a bigger spotlight put on it. That's a positive.
Yeah.
But I think in the process, a lot of people are often intimidated, when it comes to talking to somebody that's different than them, even somebody, who has a disability and, isn't that different than them in every other conceivable way, but that can be intimidating sometimes.
Yeah. There's this perception that I don't know how to communicate with you.
Sure.
And a fear of, I'm not sure that I even want to.
Right. There's that fear of, I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think comes from an honest and often good place, but can often be damaging.
Yeah.
Because it means that instead of talking to you, I'm going to just avoid you.
Yeah. Or ignore you,
Sure.
Pretend you're not there.
Well, we are just about out of time because I know
we so fast.
Yeah, it really did. Good conversations go fast. But I know we both have other things that we have to get to and everything, but I did want to end here real quick since we're talking about communication, one of the ways, as you noted at the top of the podcast, that we do communicate is through media. It's one of the ways that we often think of. So is there anything that you've been watching, reading, playing, or listening to lately that you would want to mention or talk about?
Yeah, sure. So I can't wait for more episodes of The Circle to come out on Netflix. I'm a huge fan of The Circle.
That's the reality show where they put them
yeah.
all into the separate apartments and they have
and
to communicate.
Right, through their own created social, like The Circle social media. And so I love that show a lot. So that's my current show that I can't wait to watch.
So I watched the first season of that, and I thought, this seems like a dystopian nightmare of where but what's really interesting about that show is I feel like that show, the first season came out 2 years ago or so.
Yeah, it was something like that, 2 or 3 years ago.
And how prophetic that was about the last 18 months.
No kidding.
I mean,
right.
We are all stuck inside.
Yeah.
We are communicating entirely through video chat and texting and everything. I guess we should note we are actually here in person, sitting across from each other at a table. But for the last year, we haven't been doing this. We've been video chatting for meetings and everything. So what a weirdly prophetic show.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, did they create COVID? Did The Circle have anything to do with this? Because it was the perfect setup then to continue the show.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, even when a lot of productions were having to shut down.
Right.
By its very nature, that production could continue.
Circle. And from what I understand, this is the third season. And between the first and the second, it was like almost over a year, I think, between the first and the second. But the second one just came out. It was in 2021. So this is the second season in 2021, I'm pretty sure. And from what I heard, I think they filmed multiple seasons at once. But they could do that during COVID,
right?
Because, there's no camera people. They're all placed in the apartments. I mean, there's no human interaction needed, seemingly, from a viewer's perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Or like face-to-face interaction, I guess I should say.
Right. I mean, certainly compared to more traditional reality shows, your American Idol or Survivor or something of that nature.
Right. So The Circle is I also have been trying to read more. I made it a point in 2021 to do more leisurely reading. So I have been reading some things too.
Anything good?
I recently finished a book called The Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was one of the best books I've ever read. Lisa Ling or something like that is her name. But now I'm reading Anne of Green Gables, going back to the quote unquote classics,
So did you also watch the Netflix
series?
I
did, Anne with an E. And I'm glad I watched it first because I think it's not necessarily my style of book, but it is helping me because I have pictures and voices that I draw upon as I'm reading it. And the show so closely mirrors the book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's a pretty good book.
So that brings up an interesting question. Are you the type of reader that likes to watch the movie generally first so that you have someone to picture in your mind, or do you detest that normally?
I don't have feelings about it one way or the other. I think I just happened to do this because we watched the show and then my daughter got me the book for Christmas because she thought I loved the show so much, which I did. But this was like 3 years ago, and I finished The Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane. And I'm like, well, what do I read now? And I remembered, I've got this Anne of Green Gables that I never opened. And of course, she sees me reading it. She's like, are you just now reading that? I got that for you years ago.
Has she read it?
She has not read it, and she only lasted through like one season of the show. And then she's like, not my speed.
Yeah, I could see that.
I loved it. It was a great show, though.
It was mostly people our age,
I think
really,
so.
that were really into it. It was all my female friends who were like talking to me about it constantly. So, all right. Well, Sandy, like I said, we're just about out of time. So I do want to thank you for taking some time.
This was so fun. Thanks for asking me, and thanks for doing this. Yeah, it's a great thing. I think we're doing.
Yeah, I hope so. And for those of you out there listening and everything, we will continue to do these episodes. We're not going to necessarily be on a weekly schedule, but sort of hopefully a semi-regular basis and everything. So if you want to reach out, you can reach me at justin.young@siu.edu. Sandy, if somebody had questions about the department, how could they reach you?
Yes, they can reach me at sandypc@siu.edu or look for us on socials.
Yeah, and definitely follow us on social media if you aren't already. All sorts of cool things, not just about our program, but also some of the research that our faculty and our graduate students are doing. So all sorts of neat stuff on there. So thank you for taking some time to listen with us, and we'll be back next time.